Good afternoon and welcome. Welcome to the Meet the Authors from Crisis to Catastrophe. We're so excited to have you here today. This is a webinar co-sponsored by the Gerontology Institute that's celebrating our 50th year, the Carework Network, and the Southern Gerontological Society. So glad to have you here. If you can mute your lines as we get started, that would be wonderful. Thank you so much. All right, I'm gonna stop sharing the screen so we can have a conversation with Mignon Duffy. Jeanette Dill and Juliana Martinez Franzoni were not able to come today at the last minute with care responsibilities. Not surprisingly in this day and age. Weren't able to make it, so Mignon is going to be the speaker for today, which is wonderful. And she is one of the editors and authors of a couple of chapters, including chapter 4 and chapter 2, Juliana Martinez Franzoni and Vina Siddharth, Latin America's response to COVID-19 and the risk of sealing an unequal care regime. And chapter 4, Black Lives Matter, Structural Racism, Sexism, and Care Work in the United States. Can you say that first author's name, Mignon, for me? For the
Odi Akunumi.
Thank you. And Jeanette Dill and yourself and
JMAG Karma.
Awesome. I should have asked that before we got started. So I'm gonna stop sharing and get started. If you have questions for us, I'd love for you to put that in the chat. We're gonna have a conversation with Mignon and then open it up for questions and videos. You can come on video and share your questions as you like. But to get us started, if you wouldn't mind, Mignon, talking about a takeaway from chapter 2 and chapter 4 in this lovely book.
Sure. So the chapter that I co-authored with Jeanette and Odi and JMAG is really about the intersections of race and gender and class in the labor force with health. So during COVID, we heard a lot about the racial inequities in mortality rates from COVID, and Black Americans had much higher rates of infection, but also much higher rates of hospitalization and much higher rates of mortality in the early days of the pandemic. So one of the main takeaways from our chapter is that part of the explanation for these disparate mortality rates is in occupational stratification, and in particular in the stratification of the care workforce. So part of what we do in the chapter is show that at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, 1 in 4 Black women are working in the healthcare workforce. The majority of them are working in the lowest wage part of that workforce, home health aides in long-term care facilities, where their exposure to COVID was sorry about that. Their access to protective equipment and stuff was very low. So part of what we were trying to make the link between the kind of workforce position of Black women and the exposure to COVID in that way. And then the second kind of key takeaway from that chapter was really about the historical the history that led to that particular occupational configuration. So the history of going all the way back to slavery, of the racialized division of care work that sort of divides care work and assigns the most dangerous, most difficult, most devalued aspects of care work to women of color, immigrant women, and poor women. And so all the way, you can trace the thread all the way from slavery through domestic service to the modern healthcare workforce of that racialized division of labor. And it's really a consequence of both cultural ideas about who should do what, and also structural exclusion from other jobs. So just as Black women were funneled into domestic service in part because they had so few other options, they were funneled into these low-wage healthcare jobs in part because they were systematically excluded from medical schools, from nursing schools, and other occupational spaces. So that was those were kind of the two main takeaways from that chapter that we wanted to highlight in the wake of COVID. So I'll pause for a minute because if anyone has any questions about that before I move on, I can give a little summary of Juliana's chapter. The chapter that Juliana and Vina wrote is about the Latin American context and really deals with this idea of refamilialization of care. So their argument is that the way that governments in Latin America basically didn't address COVID in a gender conscious way meant that the care work that happened as a result of the pandemic, both because of the care needs of people who got ill, but also because of closed schools, closed childcare centers, and other things, that all of that just went back onto the backs of women in households in an unpaid way. And this was after several decades of kind of feminist organizing in Latin America that had led to, in a number of countries, the development of better care infrastructure to support those care roles. And what they saw was a real backslide in a lot of those countries during the pandemic, where all of that labor just went right back into the household, into the private sphere, and onto the backs of women. So that was kind of the takeaway from their kind of high level analysis of what was going on in Latin America post-COVID.
That's a great chapter, and my favorite part is the heading "Sticky Floors, Broken Ladders, and Glass Ceilings," which is just so appropriate.
Yeah, which I can explain that for a minute if you want.
Yeah.
One of the things that Juliana and I have talked about that's interesting is these two chapters in particular really focus on the inequities in the distribution of care by gender that are similar, but also the inequities among women by race and class, right? And so our chapter really focuses on the racialization of the paid care workforce, but in Latin America, they developed this typology that really focuses on class differences between women, and sort of women that are stuck at the bottom of the labor market. That's kind of the sticky floors. The glass ceilings is kind of your professional women who are kind of stuck, can't move to the very top of the labor market. And then in the middle, she talks about women that are just living in kind of this state of precarity, right? That it's kind of, they can't kind of go up, and they are always in danger of going down. And in the chapter, they really lay out how the pandemic impacted those different groups of women differently, and in terms of their care responsibilities.
It's really cool. So the first question, these bubbled up from the class, the global economy class that Dr. Debertan is leading at the moment. But the big question that you need to answer is, what is care scholarship, Mignon?
That's a small question. So I can tell you, I would say different people would answer this question differently. So let me just preface it by saying,
fair enough.
But for me, what attracted me to the field of care is that it bridges the worlds of paid and unpaid work that for me are really at the nexus of the intersections of a whole bunch of inequalities: gender, race, ability, age, migration, globalization. Like all these kind of inequalities kind of come together in this space around the distribution of the paid and unpaid labor of care. And so We at the Carework Network kind of think of the part of care scholarship that we really anchor ourselves in is really feminist intersectional analysis of care systems that comes from that viewpoint of looking at the intersections of all those inequalities, and how important care and understanding the distribution of care is to understanding any of that, right? Like, you can't really understand the kind of intersections of race and gender in the US without understanding the distribution of care work. But you also can't really understand the distribution of care work without understanding the racialized and gendered pieces of it. So it's all at it's kind of that nexus of inequality. So that's what attracted me to the field, was the way that the concepts around that care scholars study bring together that paid work, that unpaid work, in that kind of process of inequalities in which it is nested.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I was thinking, and we have a really nice cross section of Carework scholars, SGS members, and Georgia State students. I was wondering, just to take a step back, Mignon, if you could talk a little bit about what is the Carework Network?
Oh, sure. So the Carework Network is a international network, kind of informally organized network of mostly scholars, some advocates and policymakers that really share this commitment to a feminist intersectional lens on care systems in societies around the world. So we do not have an official membership. We have a listserv that has about 800 people on it now, from all over the world. And so it's a really good resource to just tap into what people are doing in different parts of the world and how those things come together. It was actually what inspired us to do this book, was conversations that were happening on the listserv in the early days of the pandemic, where people are like, oh, this is happening in my country. Oh, this is happening in my country. What's happening over there? What's happening over there? So that was that's what we do. And we do conferences. We just did in June a big global summit in Costa Rica. So we're doing we're going to do another one in a couple of years. So that's the Carework Network. I thought I saw someone's hand up. I don't know if someone.
Nicola, did you have your hand up? Did you want to ask a question?
I did, but she made some clarification. My question was, if you wanted to be a part of the Care Network, how would you go about becoming a part of that?
Great. So we have a website that you can go to. We have a Facebook group that you can be part of, and you can also sign up for the listserv. I'll put the person's email in the chat. If you want to be part of the listserv, you email this person, Darcy Boyer, and tell her you want to be added to the Carework Network listserv, and then you're officially a member of the Carework Network. And if you want to, we also have a very collaborative, non-hierarchical leadership structure. So anyone who wants to be involved in leadership or contributing in any way to the Carework Network, we welcome. So on the website, you can find all the people that are currently on the steering committee and reach out to any one of us. And we're very happy to welcome new people on board. We're very open.
And what, for the Care Network, what skills do you have to contribute to the network?
Wow, that's a really good question. Basically, you have to have a commitment to understanding care better and wanting to make the world for care work better. And we have people who bring a whole range of skills outside of that, I would say. Jen, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think it's a great network to be a part of. Nicola is a GSU student, one of our BIS students in gerontology, which is awesome. And I think we do lots of wonderful things for students. I think it's a great network for mentoring and supportive environments for bringing along care scholars. It's where I started a long time ago.
Me too.
23 years, a long time ago. Okay, so what needs to be done? Another really big question for you, Mignon.
How to fix care.
What needs to be done about the crisis of care, and how do you foresee the future?
So I think that there are kind of two related, if we're talking kind of high level big things that need to happen. One is that we need to start seeing care as a public problem instead of a private problem. This is one of the biggest issues with care. I remember when my kids were young, everyone I knew who had young children was barely making it work. And we, had a lot of privileges that a lot of people don't have. We had jobs, we had often, family support, we had more resources than people, and still everybody was just head down trying to get through, and I think we have this idea in the United States and in lots of other places in the world as well that care is a individual or at most a family problem to solve. And I think the biggest thing that we need to do to really create better systems around supporting the care work that every single human in our society needs is by shifting that so we think about it as a collective responsibility, as something that we as a society, as one of the jobs of our society. And I think what would go along with that, if we shifted our idea about care to be more of a public collective responsibility, we would find that the policy shifts would also happen, because what the second piece of my answer to that question is increasing public investment in care infrastructure. And by care infrastructure, I mean everything from child care centers with well-paid workers to schools to healthcare facilities that everyone has access to, again, with well-paid workers, to a long-term care system that has community-based options and facilities that are well run with well-paid workers. So all of those things would flow more from a mindset of collective responsibility and public investment.
Yes, please. What are some of the key differences in care between the global north and the global south? If you could define the difference between the global north and the global south, that would be helpful too.
Sure. I mean, again, this is one of those things that if you ask different people, you'll get different answers. But for me, I think the important piece is that when you talk about the global north and the global south, it's less about geography and more about power. And so it's about kind of colonizers and colonized in some ways. It's really about kind of that distribution of power, that historical distribution of power, and places that resources have been extracted from, sort of thinking about that as the global south, and places that have been doing the extracting, sort of thinking about that as the global north. So it really reflects the kind of wealth divide, in the global wealth divide that is the result of colonialism and post-colonialism. That would be my definition, but again, you would get different definitions if you ask different people. I was thinking about this question, and one of the things that we were struck by in doing the book was both the similarities and differences. So I want to actually start with two things that we found that were very similar across very disparate parts of the world. One is that in almost every part of the world and globally, women bear a disproportionate responsibility for both paid and unpaid care work. That is sort of
universal,
shockingly similar in very, very different places. And then the second thing that we see that's a similarity is what I was mentioning before as the similarity between my chapter and Juliana's chapter, which is that in different places in different ways, other inequalities are invoked to avoid addressing the gender inequality. So, for example, Ido Peng wrote a chapter in this book that's about migration for care work. And she argues that the sort of global migration of care workers can be understood only in the context of the gendered division of care labor in the receiving country and the economic inequalities across countries. And that those inequalities are what enable and what push care workers to migrate. And what happens is that women in wealthy countries that can afford to pay migrant workers to do care work do that instead of pushing for men to do some of the care work. So the kind of that gendered division of labor gets upheld by relying on global inequalities, racialized inequalities, economic inequalities among women. And that happens across the whole world. The things that really struck me that were different were in the global South, in large parts of the global South, one of the things that needs to happen to help make the care crisis less and to help improve conditions for care is really basic infrastructure. So transportation, water, sanitation, healthcare, those kinds of things. So in more wealthy countries, I think we don't think about those things as being part of supporting care, but in a place where part of a woman's unpaid labor is spending 4 hours a day walking to a river and collecting water for her family as part of her care work, that becomes a kind of important baseline to even get that basic infrastructure built to support and really reduce the amount of time that women are spending in care work. And that kind of reducing the amount of time that women are spending in unpaid labor is a very different, looks very different in a wealthy country and in the global South. And then the second piece that I was really struck by was that a lot of countries in the global South are very tied to world financial organizations like the World Bank or loans from wealthier countries. And those multinational organizations or other countries impose financial systems on global South countries. So they impose most recently austerity measures. So the idea is, you know, if I'm a country in the global South and I want to get money to support, you know, my country, I have to agree to follow a certain number of rules. And those rules are often austerity measures that limit the amount of social spending. So a lot of the scholars from the global South, even during COVID, when they were looking at us and the US was investing, throwing money at, you know, at all sorts of things, including a lot of care priorities that since have expired. But at the time, there was, you know, investment in care infrastructure in a very different way. And our colleagues in the global South were saying, yeah, we can't do that. We don't have the capacity to really, you know, invest in that way, partly because of the restrictions of these multinational organizations like the World Bank and others. So that was another thing that really struck me as being unique to the kind of thinking about how care and care systems operate in global South countries.
Wow, that's a big one.
Yeah.
Processing. One theme throughout the book and throughout the Carework Network scholarship in general is the devaluation of care. Is there hope for care to be revalued? If so, how can one make it better? I mean, you talked about the two things, right? The two things that can be done about the crisis of care. Is this the same answer or different?
This as more of a kind of, you know, yeah, I think we always should have hope. I think the pandemic raised the visibility of care like nothing has before, kind of raised it out of the shadows. Unfortunately, that in a lot of places in the world didn't result in permanent policy change, but people are talking about care in a different way than they were before the pandemic. And that's something, right? That's absolutely something, and something important, and something that we need to continue to leverage and build on. And I think that I also think this is a generational change. When I look at, I have a 22-year-old and a 19-year-old, and when I look at them and their friends, I think their generation wants something different. They want something different to happen. And even post-pandemic, all the ways that workers are sort of pushing back on the structures of work and wanting space for care and other things to open up. I don't know that all of that is happening in totally the best ways, but I think that there's a desire for something to shift, something different to happen. So yeah, those are the two things that give me hope, is the more people are talking about care than ever before. And also I see signs that this generation wants something different to happen.
So globally, what more do we know about the impact of the conditions of care as it relates to inequality? Conditions of care as it relates to inequality. So
I mean, I sort of spoke about that when I talked about kind of the ways in which one system of inequality is used to uphold another system of inequality. So the example of Ida Pink's chapter about migration, but also thinking about another example is how there's a chapter in the book that talks about ableism and kind of the devaluation of people with disabilities, including older people with disabilities, and how that is linked to the devaluation of care workers who take care of those people. So again, it's the intersections of all those systems of inequality, I think, that really come together in care, that make it a really important space to understand.
do we want to unmute before we give her a chance to talk about what's next in the book series? Does anybody want to unmute and ask a question or put a question in the chat for Dr. Duffy? Or on one of the chapters that if you were one of the students, you might have read and thought about a little bit more? Nicola.
In relation to care work and low wages, is it, sorry, in relation to the low wages and inequalities, I've seen a theme in the book, whereas men tend to be more dominant than women, and yet still they are less involved in care work. How can we as women influence them to create some balance?
Do you mean in families, in unpaid care work, or do you mean in paid care occupations and paid care jobs?
Both, on both spectrums.
Both, okay.
Yes.
I think this is the big question, because as I was mentioning, we work really hard to not do this. We do all the things, we exploit all the other inequalities that we can to avoid doing this exact thing. And so I think this is the million-dollar question, is kind of how do we redistribute care by gender, both in the paid sector and in the unpaid realm. And I do not have a good answer for that. I think that is an ongoing cultural shift that has been very slow, that is happening in fits and starts and bits and pieces and pockets. Certainly it's happening. Certainly there is some change. It's not the same as it was 50 years ago, but it's happening at a sort of agonizingly slow pace, both in families. If you look at time use data that shows the division of labor in different sex couples in the household, it's shifted, but barely. I mean, it's a glacial pace. And occupations have barely shifted. I mean, nursing, for example, is still like, 90, I think it's 96% female. I mean, it's just, it's very, even as women have moved into predominantly male occupations, we've seen much less movement in the other direction. And part of that is because care work is so profoundly associated with femininity culturally in our society that men resist going into those jobs. And part of it is that a lot of them are not great jobs. And so men don't, you know, they don't have good wages, they don't have good benefits, they're risky jobs. So all of that is kind of tangled up in a way that it's hard to know where to exactly get in there and start. I would like to see us make them good jobs, not because men are going into them, but make them good jobs because women deserve good jobs. You know, how to kind of push back against that, I think is a very complicated, because it's so deeply embedded in our culture. Sorry, I don't have a better answer. Jen, do you have a good answer to that?
No, that's a really, really hard question. I mean, do you rebuild the infrastructure and make the jobs better paid, and then the gender division of labor, at least in the paid sector, would change? And I think there's a little bit of evidence for that, but it's so intransigent. It just doesn't move. It's
No,
impressively universal in terms of how occupational segregation works, and then how the gender division of labor works. It's so persistent that, you know, I don't know which you can shake up in order for it to work. But the investment in the care structure and the repairing the broken ladders and the, you know, breaking the glass ceilings and making the floor less sticky all seem to me to be ways in which you could move the needle, but it's not easy.
Well, actually, this other question that was shared in the chat, Mustafa, I see you there, is an interesting piece, I think, of this strategy. So this question is about in the pharmacy healthcare field, where pharmacists and techs are walking out due to poor work conditions and low wages. One of the things I think that gives the possibility for change is exactly kind of worker organizing, right? Worker organizing through formal unions and worker organizing through informal spaces as well. And I think that one of the things that when care workers organize as workers and organize around having rights as workers and organize for better working conditions, that raises the value of care both culturally and materially, right? If they win those things. Particularly if they don't argue it on the basis of we care workers are, you know, giving so much of themselves that they're, you know, they're martyrs and they're doing all above and beyond, and the kind of very feminizing language around care being valuable because it's warm and fuzzy and nice is, I think, can backfire on us when I mean, healthcare workers, nursing home workers should have adequate wages and should have good working conditions because they're human beings who are workers, not necessarily because they are doing some sort of angelic, you know, vocational task, right?
And because they have skills.
Right, exactly, right. And so it's like, for me, the labor organizing piece of it has some real legs right now, and the kind of worker organizing. And that's not to minimize the fact that care work, it can be different from other work because relationships are a big part of it, and that's super important. But I think we don't do ourselves a service when we build our whole case for care worker rights on their kind of putting them in this kind of you know, they're doing a job, they're doing a really hard job, they're doing a job that requires skills, they're doing a job that has some relational rewards, but also has some relational cost. So all of that is why they need to be treated appropriately, in my opinion.
Nicola, did you have another question? No? Okay. Anybody else? We have lots of friends on this call. Anybody interested in piping up for a second and talking to Dr. Duffy?
Anybody want to disagree with anything?
Oh, Kenny's got something in the chat.
Okay. What are your
What are you-
thoughts?
Go ahead.
The wage rate for care workers, how can the working conditions be improved? Not just to increase the labor mobility into that sector, but to reward their hard work. That's a good point that you bring up about labor shortages in the care sector, and that the kind of, need to attract more workers into the sector. And that's only getting worse, much worse post-COVID. I think that this is a two-pronged piece for me. Part of it is what I was just mentioning about labor organizing and work organizing, but I also think part of it has to be a public investment strategy. One of the things about Carework is that and anyone who has paid childcare knows this, right? That childcare is very expensive for me as a parent to pay. You're nodding, I'm guessing you have personal experience with this. But the childcare workers are getting paid very little, right? So that makes care work very difficult. So even with like worker organizing, now some spaces that's different. Healthcare organizations that are making big profits, that are paying, their nursing work assistants low wages, that's kind of a different situation. But some care work, really, it doesn't work. The market is flawed in allocating care work. And that's where I think the other piece is to really advocate for public investment into this sector, into childcare, into education, into home care, into other elder care options. Because in order to support wage growth, there has to be some increase in public investment, because families cannot absorb the cost of those increased wages individually. So, because again, there's a market, there's market failures in care work, as a free market kind of item. So that's what I would say. I don't know if you have anything to add, Jen.
No, I mean, absolutely. If we think about the long-term care arena, there are healthcare organizations that make a profit, but a lot of the healthcare organizations that are serving the most vulnerable, the Medicaid patients, the reimbursement rates are so low that the room for change is so constricted. Again, that public investment into good care and good employers is really needed in order to be able to change the wages for the care workers, and at least in long-term care sector that's largely financed through Medicaid, which is underfunded in most places. Do we have another one? Another one.
I have a comment, Dr. Duffy, and it's going to be on the tails of what Nicola had brought out, and also what you had brought out as well. You mentioned and you reference your children, your young adult children right now, and they want something different, and I concur with those thoughts. And so let's align that with, say, the students in my class. Do you think that with this generation, because I see this and I wanted to know if you see it as well, the manifestation of how we socialize our children to become young adults will have something to do with going into fields or into studies that have predominantly been female oriented. So I wanted to know your perspective on that. And I also wanted to know how you feel about policy, because a couple of Georgia State University students and myself, and that are some in this class, we advocated with our state General Assembly for policy change. Although we didn't get the monies that we hoped for care workers in the state of Georgia, we were still advocating, and we're going back again in 2024. So if you can address both of those points, that would be most helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, I think you're hitting kind of the two big levers for change here, right? One is cultural shifts, which happens through education, which parenting is part of that process of socialization and changing the kind of norms that we raise our kids with, right? So, from everything from the simplest things of, helping boys understand that they too are expected to be caregivers, giving boys dolls to play with, like very, very basic kind of normative shifts. And I think that you're right that can happen through intentional parenting, intentional education, intentionally dismantling some of those cultural norms. That's like a big, big lever. And then the second lever you mentioned is the policy lever, which is, I would say, the second kind of big lever that needs to happen, which is that we need to have a strong presence to push for this public investment and policy change around the care sector. One of the things that in the public sphere, the care sector has historically been very fragmented. So you have childcare folks, and you have elder care folks, and you have long-term, you have healthcare folks, and you have education folks who are all kind of not only operating separately, but often competing for the same pot of money. So one of the things I think that we have to do is talk more about the care sector more broadly, so that all of those constituencies see common ground and can fight for things in a different voice, right? That care workers, if you look at childcare, education, long-term care, healthcare, care workers are a quarter of the labor force. So we should be able to advocate from a position of strength instead of fighting over the crumbs that legislatures want to throw us. So I would say, yes, you've hit on I think the two most important levers of change. Absolutely. I see there's a couple of other.
Yeah, we have another question in the chat from Dion. Dion says that her family is experiencing a number of the generational, gender, and economic intersectional issues you're talking about. Young child, grandchild, and a caregiver for our 86-year-old mother. What has your research shown about sandwich families and how they're dealing with those issues?
Sure. Yeah, no, this is absolutely, the statistics show that this is increasing, right? Because people are having children later and people are living longer. And so more people are dealing with kind of caring for children, as well as caring for aging parents or other relatives at the same time. And what I would say is that all the research shows that it's really hard. That's kind of
exactly what it shows.
That's exactly what it shows. That's like a very technical, scholarly summary. It's really hard. And I think that it's one of those things. I've just been involved in this conversation that the National Academies is having around supporting unpaid caregivers. And one of the things they keep talking about is we have to keep reminding employers that caregiving for adults, for aging adults, for adults with disabilities, for children with disabilities, is all a bigger part of people's realities now. And so we have to move from a model of thinking about how to support parenting employees to how to support caregiving employees in a very more broad definition of that term. And so your example of what you're dealing with certainly is encompassing all those pieces. And I think that that's where we have to move. We have to move in the direction of really recognizing that both in our language and in our policies, that caregiving cuts across all different, and sometimes grandparents are caring for grandchildren are caring for it's all the care is going in all the different directions, right? It's not just a unilateral thing. So we have to figure out ways to both conceptualize that, think about it, and also then create policy that is supportive of all of that is happening in all those different directions.
Absolutely.
And another amplification of the last point that you made, which is if we can come together and deal with care, unpaid, paid, and different generations, you can think about how to make everything better, right? So thinking about leave and care leave in smarter ways would be just one example of that. Deborah.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
That's
I
true.
do have another quick point. Dago has made a profound point in the chat that I think is worth bringing to bear in terms of discussion, comment he's made. I could read it real quick or if something.
Yeah, I missed it. I can't see it.
He says, I have a comment. My grandma has a healthcare worker assisting, and the turnaround is very quick. I believe they make about $10 an hour, and not many people are willing to do that work for such a very low pay. Very underfunded. Remarkable, incredible point. Speak to that, please, Dr. Duffy.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's absolutely true that this is why there are such shortages right now in so many care fields. Childcare workers, there's a huge shortage. K-12 teachers, there's a huge shortage. Long-term care workers, there's a huge shortage, because at a certain point, if people have other options, which is a big if, and is, depends on what people were talking about and what their options are. But if people have other options, these jobs are just not sustainable for people. They're just not sustainable. They don't provide a sustainable income. The number of long-term care workers that are living below the poverty line despite working full-time is very high. The kind of ways in which this ironic, like the number of long-term care workers who depend on Medicaid, the number of it's not a sustainable job. And so, yeah, that absolutely is not, it's not a system that works for anyone. It doesn't work for the workers, and then consequently it doesn't work for the families who need the care because they can't find workers, and the workers turnover, as Diego pointed out. Yeah.
The latest PHI numbers on public assistance, how much public assistance care workers use, they went through the roof. I mean, they're I think it used to be a quarter to a third, and now it's closer to a half of all long-term care workers, all direct care workers are using some form of public assistance, food assistant or Circass assistance, or it's just
No, it's just not enough money, right?
no, it's just not enough money to live. Yeah. Well, if we're slowing down in terms of questions, please stick them in the chat if you have them, or unmute yourself and ask. But the next question, the last question that I have is, what's next? I know you have lots of wonderful things planned in the series, and can you give us a preview of what's coming up?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we're really excited about this book series because it's really the first place where there's kind of a designated home for, like I said, this kind of feminist intersectional care scholarship. So first of all, I just want to give a shout out to our second book in the series, which is already out, which is a book called Migrants Who Care by Fumi Showers at UConn. It's an amazing book. It's about West African women who migrate, who are nurses in Western Africa and migrate to the US, and kind of how they navigate that transition. And it's a really, really interesting and well done book. And it just complicates all sorts of things. It complicates migration, it complicates racial categories, it complicates the notion of care, and what that means in different contexts. It's a really wonderful book, and it is out. Again, it's called Migrants Who Care. And then we have another book that's in the pipeline that is in production, that is a more philosophical book. So Care Scholarship has kind of a more policy-oriented space, and then also has a more kind of philosophical, political theory-oriented space. And this book is it's an edited volume by Fiona Robinson, Sophie Bourgeot, and Maggie Fitzgerald. And I'll read you the title and you'll see what I mean, that it's more philosophical. It's called Decentering Epistemologies and Challenging Privilege, Critical Care Ethics Perspectives. But it's a really great collection of pieces by philosophers and political theorists who are kind of trying to push the boundaries of how we think about care and how we can challenge our ways of thinking about what is right and what is good in the world, and that kind of anchoring that more in care can move us into different spaces. Those are that's the one that's in production right now. We have 3 other books on the horizon. One of them is about parents of children with autism, kind of doing care work both in their own families, but also in their communities through advocacy work. It's a really, really interesting read. We have another one that is about healthcare workers, how healthcare workers in low-wage jobs make meaning out of their work, and the kind of flip side of the burnout question. So what makes people burn out and what makes people not burn out? And then we have another one that is about parenting groups, and groups, how parents kind of connect with each other in different ways and support each other in their care work. So we got a lot of things in the pipeline, and
Really do. This is so exciting.
Yes.
Do they come out basically one a year, or are they going to come out faster than that?
I think they're gonna come out potentially faster than that. So we had 2 this year, this book and then Fumi's book, and then we have 2 that probably will be coming out. We probably will have 2 coming out next year as well. So yeah, so keep your eyes open.
Okay, before you get out of here, Dr. Duffy, we have another question in the chat. What are the reasons to the pay issues among care workers? We're back to that, which is a relevant topic for the book. Does it have anything to do with training and qualifications? And if so, what can be done?
So the reasons for the pay issues among care workers. So first of all, the studies that have been done on the care wage penalty show that compared to jobs that require similar amounts of training and qualifications, care jobs are underpaid. So there's a wage penalty compared to jobs that require similar training and qualifications. So it's not because of training and qualifications. I think what can be done, I think there is a lot of theoretical reasons for the care penalty, but I think 2 of the most important are a kind of cultural reason that there's a bias towards devaluing jobs that are primarily done by women. But the care penalty is actually over and above the gender penalty, gender wage penalty. So I think that's a piece of it. And I think the other piece of it is what I was referring to before, which is what feminist economists kind of have talked about, that markets don't really work when it comes to care, because care is something that benefits lots of people besides just the one person. So if I go and buy like a fancy stereo, it's benefiting me, right? So the market, I'm going to pay on the market. The market's kind of regulate supply and demand. But if I send my kid to school, and it's a good school, and that kid turns into a person who's contributing to society because of their education that they got, that's benefiting a lot of other people besides just that kid. And so in a case like that, where there's a sort of public good that's happening, markets get messed up, and they don't sort of accurately match supply and demand to set wages and set what's needed at an appropriate level. So I'm sure there might be people on this call who can explain that better than me, who are economists, but that's my non-economist explanation of why the pay issues are there in care.
You did a great job.
Thanks.
One final question before we start to wrap things up. I'm just curious, this was a wonderful collaboration. I'm curious to know, I'm always curious to know when people write books, the title, From Crises to Catastrophe, how did you guys arrive at such a title?
That's a really great question. We wanted to emphasize that while COVID had created a lot of problems with care, that the problems with care pre-existed COVID. So we wanted to emphasize that it wasn't COVID that created the care crisis. The care crisis existed long before COVID. And so that's why we came up with this idea of kind of, there was a pre-existing crisis, and then COVID really thrust it into, the next level of catastrophe. But we really didn't want, we had names in the beginning that were sort of about COVID and the care crisis and stuff like that. And we wanted to really emphasize that all of these problems existed well before COVID. Thank you for the question.
So Amanda made a remark in the chat. SGS has a page in the website to start sharing best practices and legislation examples for addressing workforce issues. It has an aging bent, but it's available. And if you have any legislation or consider best practices that advocates could use as a starting point in terms of state policy or others, please share it with us there at that site. We'd love to get more resources there. And that is in the chat. That website's in the chat. And then our other reminders, the Gerontology Institute at Georgia State, gerontology.gsu.edu. Happy to have you visit our website. And SGS is doing their annual meeting in April, and we have opened our call for papers, and that deadline is January 8th. So we would love for anyone interested in care scholarship that intersects with aging, which a lot of it does, to think about submitting. Any last words, Mignon?
No, thank you so much for the opportunity. It makes me so happy that the book is useful to people. So I really appreciate the opportunity to come and talk to y'all about it. And I hope that y'all, have a great rest of your class. Such a fascinating class. I wish I could take it. And encourage you to reach out if you're interested in connecting further.
And we'll send a follow-up email with the recording that will have the links to all of the things that we talked about, including, I think, a discount code for the book, this fabulous book that you should go out and buy. Awesome. All right. Thank you, everybody. It's been a wonderful afternoon. Thanks for spending it with us.